time.
Hey guys, Arrow here, and today I'm going to bring you a video on different ammo types and when to and when not to use them and characteristics that they have. Obviously there are other videos like this out there, and also there's going to be guides to them on the web, so I'm probably going to find some of those, put the links in the description, because more likely than not they will be a lot better than mine and a lot more helpful. But that being said, you can always just watch the video for the gameplay, which I'm putting out there now has nothing to do with what's going to be said in this video. It's just background gameplay. So let's get started. Firstly, the basic thing to do is when looking at a tank and going to different packages, you can press Y. This is while on a tech tree, and it will give you penetration values and damage values of from 1 to 3 different types of ammo. Now this varies upon the tank you have. Obviously in this video I'm using the Object 140, so I'll just go to the tech tree on that and press Y to bring up the package of that tank. It would show me the average penetration and damage values for APCR, which would be the first one, Heat, which would be the second one, and then HE, which would be the third one. But the values that it shows you there are only the averages. If you have the tank, you can go to it in your garage, press Y there, and it will bring up a list of values for the damage from the lowest damage roll to the highest damage roll, and the penetration that it would have on that ammo type, and it will have them for all the ammo types. So that's a great way of knowing what it can roll if you're lucky. Now the way penetration works is it will show you how much armor that it can pen 50% of the time, so it's not a guarantee that it will penetrate, because RNG, as we all know, is a massive factor in the game. There are also some other terms that you don't really need to know, but just know that they do have an effect on the penetration factor of this game. There's muzzle velocity, which is basically the speed that a shell travels as it leaves the barrel of the gun. So this determines how much lead has to be given when you're trying to hit a moving target. So slower moving shells when you're given a great amount of lead time. And yeah, you can probably go online and find that somewhere. But then also experience in the game helps as well. Knowing how fast a tank can move, how fast your shot will take to hit them, and it makes leading shots a lot easier. I believe that is covered in the training. So if you haven't done training and you're new to the game and you're trying to aim at a tank while it's moving and your shots are just missing, you may want to go look at that training and you'll understand what it means to lead a shot. There's also the factor that different ammo types have different muzzle velocities even when fired from the same gun. But that'll be mentioned later when going over the different ammo types. There's normalization as well, which is an effect that I believe is only limited to AP and APCR shells, which is tricky to explain. Basically, when the shell hits the armor, the angle at which it hits will decrease a little bit, which decreases the effective thickness of the armor that it's hitting and makes it easier to penetrate. So say that it was to hit a 45-degree angle piece of armor. Normalization would mean that it would hit maybe 40 degrees. So whereas before it might have been a bounce, now it will be a penetration. But the reason I'm saying I think that's only limited to AP and APCR shells is because if it's angled armor, then heat would not be a valid option. But as I said, that'll be mentioned at a later time. I believe that's everything. Obviously, if I did miss anything, there will be other guides linked in the description, and hopefully they will mention it. But with that said, let's move on to different ammo types, and it will make sense to start with armor piercing, as that is the most common shell type in the game for any direct fire tanks, which is anything that isn't artillery. That being said, there are some artillery in the game that do have the option to use armor piercing, although it isn't the standard round for it. The main things about armor piercing is that it's heavily dependent upon how much energy it carries, so basically a high velocity gun, better chance of pen. But due to them being heavily dependent on the energy that it carries, this does mean that the penetration values will be better at close range than it will further away. So over 100 meters, it will lose penetration values. So whereas you might be bouncing, say 150 meters away on the side of a tank, you then get to within 100 meters and magically you're then penetrating the spot that you were bouncing. This could also be influenced by RNG, so tricky thing, knowing the penetration values, but that's why knowing weak spots on tanks also helps. As mentioned earlier, armor piercing does have a normalization factor, and from what I understand that's 5 degrees. That was used in the example earlier, which makes them the most ideal of any ammo type for getting through well-angled armor. As mentioned earlier, armor piercing standard rounds for most tanks in the game, and that is the case because from tier 1 through to tier 10 it is the standard round that you get given in most. The exceptions being artillery and I believe it starts at tier 9, definitely tier 10, mediums get given APCR as standard rounds. There are some tanks which you definitely shouldn't use armor piercing on, and that'll be low velocity howitzers, such as the 152mm guns that you get on the SU-152, ISU-152 and KV-2. They all get armor piercing as standard rounds, but those guns are really best when firing HE, obviously due to the low penetration values of the armor piercing rounds. I believe that's covered it all for AP. I'll summarise them all at the end. So it makes sense to move on from AP to APCR, which stands for armor piercing composite rigid, and basically they do the same thing as the armor piercing shells, but they have an advantage of being lighter, so they have a faster muzzle velocity than the armor piercing shells due to that decreased weight. That also means that they can penetrate armor more effectively than armor piercing shells, and due to the increased muzzle velocity they will move faster through the air, meaning less lead time needs to be given to hit moving targets. But like armor piercing, APCR does lose speed over a distance, and as such penetration as well. It does, however, lose speed faster than standard AP shells. As well as that, another possible disadvantage would be the fact that it only has 2 degrees of normalization compared to armor piercing's 5. On top of that, APCR is pretty expensive, so personally I would say it's only used when needed, and that usually tends to be when armor piercing shells are not enough to reliably penetrate enemy tanks. Although bearing in mind that APCR do have some disadvantages compared to armor piercing, which reduce their penetration values, it's not completely enough to negate the penetration advantage that you do get with APCR. So obviously if you're bouncing with AP over a distance, there is a chance that you can penetrate with APCR, but I wouldn't count on it. Personally, I only use APCR at a close distance, or when in a tight situation and severely outnumbered and you need every shot to penetrate. But like every shell in the game, you can't tell someone when to and when not to use them. It's all up to them. And I do get a bit annoyed when people just spam premium all the time, but I do have a confession to make, and that is that I load full APCR in the AMX 1390. That's purely because you see tier 10s like the 100s with it, and it's pretty funny when you catch them in the open and they present their butt plate to you unangled, thinking that you can't penetrate it, and then you just leave them sitting there dumbfounded as you unloaded your 6-shot clip into them, penetrated every time, reduced them by over half health, and then driven off. But I believe that sums up APCR, so let's move on to HE. So obviously HE stands for high explosive. Well, I say obviously, people might not know that, but now you do. HE equals high explosive. And basically, they're shells that are filled with, you guessed it, explosives. And they tend to be the most common shell type for non-direct fire tanks in the game, so artillery. Now, the penetration and damage mechanics of HE shells are probably the most complicated out of all shells in the game, and that's because they do not rely upon penetration values. They rely more upon burning through enemy layers of armor and then exploding in the core of the tank. However, they can prematurely detonate and do minimal damage. But due to being able to prematurely detonate, they can do splash damage, which is why they're such a useful thing for artillery, because even if they don't hit, they can hit close to the target and still manage to do damage. Now, HE is very useful for damaging external modules of the tank, such as viewport, tracks, guns, and I just punched myself in the face. Look, I'm not even going to edit that out. I went to move my mic slightly closer to my face, the mic got jammed, and when it did move, I had enough force behind my hand that I just punched myself. Anyways, as I said, HE shells are complicated and difficult to understand, and I'm not going to lie, I don't really understand how they fully work myself, so I'm not going to go into detail about them. But knowing when to use HE or most guns boils down mainly to experience, and that's how I figured out what guns I can and can't use HE with against certain tanks. Still, there are some cases where HE is a obvious choice. As I mentioned earlier, low velocity howitzers, such as the ones on the SU and ISU 152 and the KV2, and not to mention artillery. It's also a viable option for base resets, if say a tank is in the base and it's hull down, or it's at an angle where you can't penetrate it with your standard or armor piercing rounds. Just fire HE at it, and there is a possibility that you will do a little amount of damage or damage an external module, which will get that reset. Obviously, as I said, boils down to experience, knowing whether your gun has the HE capabilities to deal that little amount of damage, because certain tanks firing HE can bounce against tanks if there is high enough amounts of armor on that tank. Main thing I use HE for though, and this is just me personally, low armored tanks. Well, say low armored tanks, poorly armored tanks would be a better choice of words. So, artillery. From time to time, if I know I have a high enough caliber gun, because there have been cases in the past where I've used HE with mediums, and it's done very little damage, and then I've died because of it, whereas an armor piercing round would have killed him. So yes, I tend to use armor piercing most of the time against artillery. But the WoT E100 line, so can't remember what the hell the tier 5 was. But even that, tier 2 and up for the German tank destroyers along the WoT line. Weakly armoured, you can fire HE at them, do a lot of damage. And it's especially useful against the WoT Alpha Panzer and Waffentrager Alpha E100, and that's because firing HE at the gun shield on those tends to damage the gun as well. So that's my take on HE. Obviously probably go to someone else's guide for use on that. So let's go from HE to premium high explosive. It's pretty much just the same, just with added splash capabilities. Well, that one was easy. So let's move on from HE to HESH. Now HESH stands for High Explosive Squash Head shells, and I could say what they are, but what's the point, because the realistic properties aren't simulated in the game. That was a lucky shot, especially it was auto aim. He was on the move, through buildings, and I don't know how that managed to hit. But anyway, as I was saying, HESH's realistic properties aren't simulated in the game, and pretty much in-game HESH are simply HE rounds with inflated penetration values. Other than that, they behave the exact same way as HE. However, unlike HE, I believe, to the best of my knowledge, that HESH is only used in high tier British tanks. If anyone knows of a tank that isn't British, and that isn't, say, tier 9 or 10, that uses HESH, then please do say so in the comments, because I'd like to know as well. But anyways, let's move on to the final ammo type, which is HEAT. Now, HEAT stands for High Explosive Anti-Tank. And like High Explosive, this again explodes on impact. However, unlike High Explosive, it does not have splash. What HEAT is designed to do is to explode on impact and create a concentrated stream of molten metal, which would punch through the vehicle's armour. And as such, HEAT ammunition can be thought of as an armour piercing version of HE. And I believe it has some of the highest average penetration values in the game, outperforming APCR in most situations. Now I say most, and that's because well-angled armour, sloped armour, or spaced armour, as HEAT is like High Explosive, it will explode on impact, and as I said earlier, unlike High Explosive, this does not have any splash damage. There is, however, an upside to HEAT, and that is, although it has a slower muzzle velocity than AP or armour piercing, it doesn't lose penetration over distance. So when should you use HEAT? Well, it's mainly used in the same situations as APCR. That was a bad shot and I got very lucky. Anyways, as I was saying, same situations as APCR. So that's obviously with the exceptions of shooting at tracks, gun mantlets, and thick pieces of spaced or well-angled armour. And instead focus on shooting flat pieces of thick armour. So for example, I'm going to use the Object 140 and the tank I'm shooting at, which will be the Panzer E100. If that tank had been facing me and he was hull down, yes, I could have shot his machine gun on top of the tank, but chances are from this distance I would bounce anyway. So the viable option would have been to load up HEAT and shoot through the side of the superstructures. An example of when not to use HEAT: let's say there's an IS-7 side scraping and all you have is his side armour to shoot at. No, if you're firing HEAT at that, you're just going to bounce straight off it, because it's well angled and it's spaced armour anyway. And I believe that explains heat. Obviously, as I said, there will be other guides, so you can go to them. But give a brief summary of all of them. Armor piercing, normalization of 5 degrees. It is affected by distance. It cannot pre-detonate. The muzzle velocity is average, and there is no splash damage. APCR, normalization of 2 degrees. It is affected by distance at a greater rate than armor piercing. It has a faster muzzle velocity, and due to that, the downside to the greater rate of penetration lost by the distance is not entirely negated, so it will have a higher pen. It cannot pre-detonate, and it has no splash damage. HE and HESH, no normalization, is not affected by distance. It can pre-detonate. It does not have a ricochet angle. However, there is a slight option that it will not do damage. The muzzle velocity is slower, and they have splash damage. Heat, no normalization, is not affected by distance. It can pre-detonate. It can bounce. The muzzle velocity is slower, and there is no splash damage. And that's about it from me. So I hope you enjoyed the gameplay in the background, and if you really want to understand the types of ammo that there are, go to one of the ones in the description. Because as far as I'm concerned, I just made a very bad explanation of all of them. But thanks for watching, guys, and just to briefly explain what these little clips have been at the end, they're what to expect from an upcoming video. And as such, they don't give away much of what happened in that battle. So, just wait for them. Until next time.